to another. Now, if we compare a ratio scale to the traditional scale that's used for research, which is called a Likert scale, we can see where there are constraints. On a Likert scale, it's some variation of good, very good, fair. It may be 5 points, it may be 3 points, but these increments of distance have some difficulties. One is that it presumes something as sophisticated as a human psychology or attitude can be measured on 5 discrete points. That's traditionally not true. Another issue is that people who are doing the research actually take the variables very good and good and lump them together and call it positive, throw out the middle, and then lump the two that are negative together, and to the extent that somebody troubled him or herself to distinguish between 5 discrete points, it gets reduced to 3. There you go, back to that gross trend data, sort of favorable, sort of negative. It reduces the information that we actually got.
Another issue with Likert scales is not being able to measure change over time. Take bin Laden as an example of someone about whom we have had extreme changes in attitude over time.
On a Likert scale, in the U.S., prior to the tragic events of 9/11, if we had used a Likert scale and said, what do you think of bin Laden? People would have typically said very bad. As events occurred and it became even more in the public domain, and we had still used a Likert scale and said, all right, contrarily, we go to the Muslims in the Middle East and say, on a Likert scale, what do you think of bin Laden? People would have said very good. Now imagine that time continues, the events become more in the public theater, and we go back and use that Likert scale and say in the U.S., all right, now what do you think of bin Laden? People would have said, yet again, very bad. The facts are that their emotions would have become more extreme, but they have no way to show it on the scale. We have no means to show change of attitude over time if we use a Likert scale. The same thing holds if we had gone to the Middle East. There's no way to show people's enthusiasm or vigor. It simply constrains people's abilities to show attitude change. Another example, if you've seen the movie 10, on the scale, if you remember, Dudley Moore was infatuated with Bo Derek and had gotten to such a state that he went to a psychiatrist and asked, I don't know what to do. And the doctor had said on a scale of 1 to 10, what do you think of her? How would you rate her? And he said 11. People cannot stay within the constraints of a scale if they feel enthusiastic about whatever the subject is. What we want to do is create a scale that allows people to show the range and the dexterity of their thinking over time. Now here's an example of what a fractionation scale does that solves that problem. And in this particular study, it was taking a look at young adults' attitudes about themselves. And here, what we say is, if 0 is not at all important, and we set a target or at least a scale that gives them a middle range, 10 is average, how important is it to you to, and then the dimensions show up. People can use any number above 10 they want. Typically what they'll do is set an upper limit around 25 or 30, and then they'll start to scale relative to that upper limit. It's common for people to set an upper limit around 25, for example, and then start to go back and forth. Once they see another variable, they may say, oh, make that a smidge more, make that a slightly higher score. What this does is let us get much better interrelational data. It helps us understand the relative numbers of how people think from one variable to another. It gives us much more precise interlinkages among factors. Here's an example of some data that was conducted or collected by a company that participates in the Mayflower study, which is an employee attitude survey. The advantage of it over time has been that companies all participate, and then they can compare their unique company results with the group norms in their industry. In this instance, a company came to us and said, look at this data. And we said, well, statistically, you would treat all three of those departments exactly the same. There is no difference among those scores. And they said, that's right. That's why we're here. We know that this data is wrong. Department 1 has our Green Beret team. They come in early, they stay late, they work above and beyond the call of duty. There's something wrong with this data. We redid it using the fractionation scale. And here you can see where the average score, the mean in the first column, indeed shows Department 1 as 3 times above average, whereas Departments 2 and 3 were considerably less. And given that we are using the ratio scale, we could run very pure correlations to take a look at this and suggest what's driving Department 1's results, what's holding back Department 3's results, which of course gives us a strategy. We could then turn and say, if you want the scores to improve in Departments 2 and 3, here are the specific things you can do that would make the difference. The advantages then of fractionation are that you get greater variance among the factors that you're looking at. The measurement is extremely precise. There is no measurement error in the scaling itself, and it allows you to be highly predictive about what to do. The third element within the quantitative dimensions is multidimensional scaling, which is just a higher order of what fractionation scales do. It's a form of factor analysis. It is a non-standardized factor analysis, and for those of you that have worked with standardized factor analysis, this is just a more precise way of getting to the data that we're looking at. In factor analysis, the technique that's used is to, if you have hundreds of variables you're trying to deal with, rotate the data in a way that creates clusters so that you can reduce the number of variables down to a fewer set of themes that seem to align with each other. In standardized factor analysis, the way that is done is called Procrustes rotation. The name Procrustes rotation is apt in that it comes from a mythological character who was an innkeeper who was an unusual gentleman. He believed that his patrons needed to fit exactly into the bed. So if someone was too short for the bed, he had a series of pulleys and slats that made it fit just snug. However, if someone was unfortunate enough to be too tall for the bed, he guillotined off their feet to make the fit. The problem that we see with standardized factor analysis is that it mains the data and forces the data to fit into the clusters so that you can create a reduced number of themes. With non-standardized factor analysis, you don't have to main the data. You keep the integrity of all of the variables whole so that the accuracy of the relationships holds true.